In the morning, when Joy and Chloe woke up at their grandparents' house, they really had no idea where the day would take them. But later, when they looked back upon the hours and days and months and even years that preceded the events of June 22nd, 2017, they realised that it had always been their destiny. There had been signs and vibrations of their future in every silky thread of the web that was spun and joined together throughout their existence. Joy and Chloe's lives were about to be transformed by a divine power that changed everything, and nothing could ever be the same, in every step and micro-movement. Forevermore, they would be aware of their journey through time and space. Along the arc of the planet, they could feel the many dimensions and openings, the secrets and invisible realms that surround us always, but which most never come to know. Do you realise that right now, as you lie in your perfectly still bed, the earth is carrying you 600 miles an hour as it turns to shy away from the sun? Did you know that on some days, the sun, Lucifer, is so wild that magnetic angels materialise to hold our earth inside their hearts and shield us from his fury? The night before, the girls had been put into the same big bed in the garden room at the back of their grandparents' house. Chloe woke up first. Joy's sleeping knee pushed her in the stomach, so she turned over in sleep to face the window, and a stripe of bright sunlight fell across her eyelids. She lay still for a moment, watching little sparks of dust spiralling in the brilliantly illuminated streams that flowed into the room from the gap between the window frame and the straight edges of the blind. The sound of the fish pond fountain in the garden seemed to click on, and Reginald, their grandparents' Jack Russell, raced into the girls' room. His galloping paws and the jangle of his collar made Joy stir sleepily. He jumped onto her pillow and nuzzled her awake, pawing around in circles between the girls and finally settling down as they both scratched his belly. He stretched out like elastic in his pleasure and pushed his compact paws into the girls, widely yawning. Nan shouted up the stairs.
"Reg, get down here!"
The dog sprang up and charged back downstairs. The girls heard him pound down the carpeted steps like a sack of potatoes had been poured down them. And then the sound changed sharply as his claws hit the floorboards of the kitchen, and then they clattered and scraped horizontally. They heard his brass name tag clang against the metal of his dog bowl, and they listened to the birds in the garden.
"It's a woodpecker,"
said Joy. Chloe slid quietly out of bed and carefully raised the blind. A flash of green and red rose and fell, dipping in the air from the roof of the house. The bird swooped onto the sloping roof of the conservatory under their window and sat on the edge of the black guttering. Chloe stood motionless and whispered excitedly. Joy crept out of bed and over to the window. The bird sat perfectly still, directly facing the girls. Then it hopped a little towards them. Joy and Chloe turned to each other and widened their eyes in amazement. It bobbed even closer, over the undulating corrugated plastic roof, which was spotted in places with moss and new green shoots. Joy felt for Chloe's hand on the windowsill and squeezed it. The bird was now just a few inches away. They could see its glowing black and white eyes dancing in close-up. It looked right at them, and then its gaze shot from one to the other. Its feathers were bright green, and it had a fine red cap and stippled white breast. It was the most incredibly lovely creature. Finally, it came right up to the glass and loudly tapped with its strong beak on the window. The girls couldn't believe it. It looked totally unafraid. Joy put her finger on the window and the woodpecker tapped upon it. Chloe did the same, and the woodpecker repeated the tapping motion. The girls were so mesmerised by the woodpecker, they did not at first notice the magpies hopping towards them. It was the glittering jewel-like plumage of a kingfisher that first made them realise there were more birds approaching. Joy gasped. The entire roof was crowding with all kinds of different birds, some of which Joy and Chloe had never seen before. A heron drifted solemnly into the centre of this assembly of birds. It was as if he were descending from heaven, and the sparrows, starlings, robins, wrens, and tiny goldcrests cleared a circle so that he could land. When he touched down, his long neck reeled in like a feathery serpent, and he adjusted his wings. His long black toes curled over the uneven surface, stretching the little webbed sections. He shifted onto one foot like a flamingo. The children were silenced by this extraordinary sight, their senses so entirely overwhelmed that they hadn't noticed their Nan's footsteps coming up the stairs. She spoke before she set foot in the room, and at this sound all the birds erupted like a black breath at once from the roof, cutting out the light from the sun momentarily and darkening the room. Their reverie broken, the girls turned around simultaneously. They hadn't noticed what their Nan had said, so now as she stood in the doorway, her left hand resting on the door handle, her right cradling a cup of coffee, she repeated her message.
Kids' breakfast!
They mouthed as if to speak, but nothing came out, and already their Nan was heading back downstairs and swearing at the dog, which nearly tripped her over and made her spill a little from her cup of coffee as he bolted back upwards. Looking out of the window, everything appeared to have returned to normal. Reginald pounced on the bed and writhed around, wrinkling the still warm blankets. Chloe was the first to speak.
Well, that was really weird.
Joy looked first at Chloe and then down to her hands, then to the fingerprint with which she had touched the woodpecker against the glass. There was a drop of blood there. She stared at this. It didn't make sense. The woodpecker had been the other side of the glass, and there was no mark or break in it. She looked at this perfect, lucent ruby jewel. She felt radiant, and a prickling sensation rose from the base of her spine to the crown of her head.
Chloe, look where the woodpecker was.
Chloe's head shifted backwards first with incredulity, and then forwards with curiosity, and when she turned her hand over and examined her own fingertip, she saw the same mark. It was a convex blood mirror of their room. She stared into the tiny reflection. Joy looked into it as though it may be a crystal ball into another dimension. Right now, she had no expectation of what may or may not happen. The future had been set free from the stays of the past. Chloe looked closely at the window where the woodpecker had been. There wasn't the slightest scratch on either side. They seemed both to not want to disturb their respective drops of blood, to not want to smash the bending mirror of their reality. They held their fingers out awkwardly and proceeded downstairs as if taking part in some ancient ritual sacrifice. Something stopped them from excitedly telling their Nan and Grandad about what had just happened. It seemed as though the universe had opened up to show them something secret and special, something just for them. They were thinking with one mind now. Joy could feel Chloe's thoughts flowing into her own. They just had to look at one another to know everything. At first, Chloe found this so strange. She crinkled her forehead. And then they became acquainted with this new way of thinking and feeling somehow. Some new miraculous power had overtaken them. The morning passed in a sort of highly focused blur. Normal life melted around them, and they barely noticed it until they had stopped an hour or so later in their grandparents' car, in a gravelled car park, the click and clunk of seatbelts and doors, their feet on small crunching stones, a strong breeze from the sea. They came to the lobby of the aquarium and entered a dark, dripping tunnel. It was cool and planted with ferns. There were huge tanks filled with large grey fish, the constant murmurings of water and gurglings of pumps. From somewhere they were joined by their cousins George and Mary. Altogether they ran over to a huge pool. Chloe and George were just tall enough to rest their elbows on the top of the tank. Joy, on tiptoes, could see over the edge of the thick glass sides. Her fingertips turned white as she tried to lift herself up to see in. Mary was the smallest and only halfway up the side. She stared straight into the murk at the stingrays. The rays flew through the water, gracefully waving their wing-like fins and travelling round and round in a serene circle. Joy reached her fingertips out as a stingray's nose peeked above the surface of the water.
Joy, you're not allowed to touch the stingrays. Look at the sign.
Then, honestly, without knowing how or why, Joy splashed down into the tank. One moment she was on tiptoes, and the next she was surrounded by the rays and drawn into the middle of the tank. Chloe dived in after her without thinking. The girls should have been able to stand up easily in the water, but some power was taking them over. The pool shone with many different lights and rare colours. The rays seemed to have some design, some instruction. They tightened their circle. They drew a line. The surface of the water rippled, radiating outwards from the centre. It became electrified or magnetised. No one who was there could quite describe it. The girls, in some state of rapture, were glowing, and then to all who were witness that day, they vanished. As if in some strange echo of the morning's events, Chloe was the first to wake, shivering wet. The sound of a seabird soaring overhead pierced the silence of her sleep. It was not quite the seagulls she knew. It cast a shadow. Perhaps it was an albatross. Chloe opened her eyes nervously. She could hear tiny bubbles bursting in the wet sand, and she was lying in a shallow tide. She felt first for Joy, and immediately her sister's limbs moved and her heart suddenly relaxed. They had washed up on a strange shore. She could see no buildings, no people. The beach was from another time. They were alongside a huge boulder of bright white quartz. Everything felt utterly different, supernaturally still. Joy woke now. She had already felt Chloe's first impressions in her mind before opening her eyes. As she moved, she realised there was no sense of weight or force somehow. It was as though they were made of air, of spirit. And whilst they were recalibrating to this new awareness, some serene wave of ether rolled over them and manifested the way an unfolding rose might come into full bloom. Now, stood barefoot on the sand before them, was a woman in rich golden robes. She was giant and statue-like, towering over them, a titaness. When she spoke, it was as though the music of her voice held their souls in space, and they trembled with the magic of it. She reached out for Chloe's hand. You, child, are the green shoot of Demeter, the future of the world. Then she reached out her other hand to Joy. And you, dear one, are the bliss of true love.